Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Hannah Wilson, the founder and director of Diverse Educators. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today. Please could you share with us the DEIJ Hot Take that is currently guiding some of your work?
Morning, Daryl. It's great to be here. And yes, a timely one. The Supreme Court judgment in the UK that was published a few weeks ago. My provocation is it's not a win for women. It's a regression for the LGBT community here in the UK and beyond.
Now, thank you so much. A very timely one. Hopefully, this will not be long before this episode is released, but this was back in April that this took place. And there are many takes on this judgment with many valid perspectives. But what we're going to do here today is get a great clarification on a well-researched consideration of the recent events. Now, Hannah, could you take us through how this may impact inclusion of LGBTQ plus communities in education, for example, why you feel this is a hot take, and how you're responding to these changes in your work?
Sure. It's a really complicated, complex one, and it's really sensitive and really political. And what we've tried to do as a team is almost like anchor it in neutrality and objectivity to help schools cut through all the noise and all the opinion and all of the misinformation to think, what does this actually mean for us as educators, as school settings? And what does this mean for safeguarding? What does this mean for us keeping our communities safe? And I find lots of things are triggering and lots of things cause a lot of emotional charge. This one I find really curious. I'm a feminist, identify as being a cisgender heterosexual woman. I've got lots of friends who are feminists. And this idea that we're now pitting sort of like the sex characteristic of women against trans women, and this idea that we're like some groups are excluding groups based on those characteristics. I find it's quite a hard one to talk out with people because people have got such strong opinions on it. And I've had lots of people reach out to me, people who don't work in education, people who are parents and carers of children in schools. It doesn't directly impact them, but it impacts their friends or their children's friends at school. And people are just really curious and want to talk it out, but don't know where to start really with talking it out. And I think that's an important thing for us to consider, how we create spaces to listen and learn and talk and almost take the emotional charge out of it. So when a group of my team said to me, what are we going to do about this? Like, shall we write a blog collectively? And it took us quite a considerable amount of time to craft it. And then we talked about who wanted to publish it. And we decided to publish it as an organisation because it's a collective voice. It's also an organisational standpoint. So if you do follow Diverse Educators' work, please do go onto our blog. And it was a blog last week called The Supreme Court Ruling. And we sent it out to a warm audience, first of all, to get some feedback. So we've held a number of events in the last few years that are trans solidarity virtual events, safe spaces. We've also got the people who contributed to the book in Diverse Educators, the manifesto. We've got a gender reassignment section. So there's 12 contributors there. So we sent it out to them to say, please, can you read this and be our critical friends? Is there anything that misrepresents or like misguides people? We had some really helpful tweaks just come back around language or things that needed to be a bit more explicit. Then it went live at the weekend. And we've all been checking in, like expecting quite a barrage of critique and hate and shade. And actually, it was really quiet for a week. And then we've only had 2 messages. One message from a parent, just clarifying some things they weren't sure about in it. And then we've had a couple of messages, actually, from trainee teachers who identify as being non-binary and trans, asking for support. Like they are either about to start their teacher training or they are looking for their first job in education. And we're being asked for support on how do you work out if a school is trans inclusive or trans exclusionary, what a school standpoint is. So it's actually been quite heartening at how it's been received. We've had lots of positive feedback that we've cut through all the noise to try and make it really practical about the things we need to consider around the impact this is going to have on any school setting and workplace, because it's for the adults as well. And what are the next steps, I guess, for school leaders and governors to consider?
I mean, I'm loving this because I think for many people in education, the idea of approaching something with objectivity and, there's a little bit of a negative stigma against the idea of what it means to be neutral. And people often see that as a bad thing. But I've read the article, I've read many of the supporting materials that you have in Diverse Educators. And I'm not surprised at all there hasn't been a barrage or a backlash as such, because it is very well measured, and also written inclusively. So sorry, just to celebrate that work that's being done.
Well,
A
thanks to the
question.
team. Like, I just hit publish. Like, I've been supporting them, but I think it is that, and like for them, this is their lived experience as well. And actually, they've had to almost take a step back and think, take me out of this situation, and actually, what does this mean for everybody? And I think that's what we get wrong sometimes in this space. It becomes very centered around who I am and my identity, my lived experience, and this is about people in our circles, people in our networks, and considering them.
Yeah, I could talk to you for hours about this. A question that I have, which may be of interest to our listeners, is just the idea, especially within a UK context, but I think many schools can relate to this. But the culture of compliance we often see in schools, and with large level decisions like this being made by courts, what do you foresee as some of the unintended or sometimes harmfully intentional consequences that can happen when compliance culture meets a change in interpretation of something as central as sex and gender?
I think that's a really good question. And one of the things I always say in our training is like compliance isn't enough. Like compliance is the bare minimum. And yes, we need to be legally compliant, but what does best practice look like? That's what we should be. That should be what we're striving for. Like what the best practice to ensure that we're doing more than, and we're not just doing the bare minimum. So I think from a compliance point of view, it's making sure that we have reviewed our qualities policy and our qualities objectives, and there's outdated language. Sometimes terminology needs to be reviewed, just to make sure there's absolute clarity. But then also looking at in conjunction with the safeguarding policy and thinking about what does this mean for our safeguarding culture and compliance within our school. And the big one, and I'm halfway through writing a blog about toilets, because the big one is around the spaces in a school where children and staff go to the toilet and get changed. And we've seen a pattern over the last few years that there's some very sincerely intended decisions being made to include, but actually they're not always legally compliant. And that then leaves you really exposed as a school.
Yeah.
So if I give you an example, I became a head teacher in 2016 and the school opened in 2017. It was a brand new school building. And I wanted gender neutral toilets, but I couldn't have gender neutral toilets based on how the building had been designed. So
Yes.
we had 3 floors and 9 corridors, and there was a block of toilets at the end of each corridor. And there were 4 male cubicles and 4 female cubicles. And then there was a disabled toilet in the middle. We wanted gender neutral toilets, but because you had to walk into a separate standing space and because the doors didn't touch the ceiling and the floor, those
Yeah.
toilet cubicles were not allowed legally to be gender neutral toilets. So
Hmm.
instead, we took down all the disabled toilet signs on the door in between the 2 blocks, and that door was ceiling and floor touching. And we put a sign on there saying this is an inclusive, accessible toilet. Anybody
Yes.
may use it. So that
Yeah.
was our way of really, and this was 8 years ago. So that was our way of making sure that there were inclusive toilets and changing rooms, clearly labelled, but we were also legally compliant. And I think schools do need to do a bit of a walk around and check this, because some schools are unintentionally breaking the law, and that's problematic. So when I'm working with boarding schools, independent schools with different kind of shaped buildings, or quirky sort of state schools with in old buildings, as they go and find an individual toilet that, like, perhaps it's a staff toilet, but it's a toilet by itself with a door that opens onto the corridor, and put a sign on that one, that's your gender neutral toilet. So we can make this happen, but we need to be a little
Yes.
bit creative, but we also need to be really careful that we are being compliant at the same time.
Thank you for clarifying that so well. I think many teachers and many people working in schools and even other buildings will find that useful, because I think the idea of changing the space, we often we've had episodes before about using the space to be inclusive, in ways that can be flexible to laws which can be interpreted in very exclusionary ways. But it can be, and I've worked at schools which have had open plan toilets which are legally compliant. So it can be done. So thank you for those examples. As a second question, as we move forward, and very much linked to this, when we look at this situation, a big part of the challenge is this restrictive identity label, categorizing people in very reductive ways, which have legal precedent, and it can lead to very difficult scenarios. So what does it look like, or what does it mean for you, for schools? You've just given a great example, but perhaps more broadly, to go beyond things like gender binaries. And I would actually take this to concepts of transracial, people being defined outside of our normative assumptions and hegemonical structures. What does that kind of mean for you?
That's a big question, Daryl.
It is.
I'll give some practical things to think about here. And this is really current for me. I applied for a role last night, and when I was filling in the equalities form, the question and answer set was wrong for gender and sex. And I see this quite a lot. So I want to start there with the fact that, yes, the Supreme Court judgment is protecting women through the sex characteristic, but trans and non-binary people are still protected through the gender reassigned protected characteristics. So they're still protected in law. It's just that we've got a little bit of a conflict of attention now between those two. So that's my first point. So I would really encourage anyone listening to go and look at how we capture and handle data and report data in our schools, students and staff. So if I start with recruitment, so we're working with schools, colleges and trusts who are doing brilliant work on inclusion, particularly around trans and non-binary inclusion. But then when you apply for a job at their school, the question answers in the application form aren't right. So we're saying we're trans inclusive, but if you're a trans non-binary person, you haven't got a question cell or option that's right for you. So that to me is coding. I'm not included here. So it's making sure that the documentation, the equalities monitoring form is correct. Similarly with the children or the parents and carers of children, thinking about admissions forms, how are we asking questions, what data are we handling, how does that pull through to our data systems and how are we reporting? And one of the arguments at the moment is, are there two sexes or are there three sexes? And there's an argument here, but I believe that there is male, female and intersex, and I know people who are intersex. So even being clean and clear on that language, we often use the word gender when we mean sex.
Yes, yeah.
And then thinking about gender identity, gender expression, because a lot of people I know have rejected the terminology of gender reassignment. It feels quite reductive and it feels quite about the kind of the intervention rather than the human being. So I think there's a piece here about the literacy, the consciousness, the language, and making sure that if we think we're being inclusive, the behaviour, the language, the policy and the processes we're using are also being inclusive, because sometimes we're undermining ourselves. And if I go back to the example of aspiring teachers contacting us to say, thinking about applying for a job at this school, is this school trans inclusive? That's quite a hard one for us to make a judgment on. We can say whether we know anyone's working there, whether we've done any training with them, for example, but we don't know who is self-deselecting from our schools. We don't know what staff aren't applying to work with us or volunteer with us as governors. We don't know which parents and carers are looking at our website, our prospectus, and thinking, my child won't be safe there, my child won't be seen there. So that's the bit we need to think about. We need to design inclusive schools that attract diverse characteristics, as opposed to focusing on diversifying, but the school isn't actually inclusive for those pupils or those adults to then exist in when they join us.
Thank you so much. Data, the way it walks through into the lived reality, how it affects who is present, who is allowed to be present, and who feels that they're allowed to be present, or that they belong there. Critical stuff. And yes, we could go much further, but thank you for handling a question which was perhaps a bit too broad in its delivery. But as we get to this point here, what I would love to ask you is just if you have, and I know you do because I've explored many of them, but a key takeaway, a resource, a reflective question, but something for people to take away where they can go further with some of the ideas and the things that you've discussed today, which they might want to learn more about.
Yep, sure. Okay, so and all these links will hopefully be at the bottom of the
100%.
webcast as well. So I would go to our blog first of all, because the blog is an anchor to help you process this judgment. And if you're in a UK school, what does it mean for us? But if you're in a British overseas school, what does it mean for you in that setting as well? And there's always that tension, isn't there, about the local law versus the kind of the British law. So start with the blog, and there's some signposting in the blog. There's also some suggested things to consider or to do or take action as a result of reading the blog. The next step I'd suggest is you go to our toolkits. So we've currently got 43 DEIB toolkits on a range of different themes, and we've got a toolkit all around transgender rights. So there'll be key information to process, some key questions to consider, and then there's usually 6 articles, 6 blogs, 6 podcasts, 6 TED Talks for you to do a bit of a deeper dive. So that would be my next step. And then if you are a trans ally and you want to find out more and be part of a kind of a space, I mentioned already, we've hosted 2 virtual events over the last 18 months around trans solidarity. We are hosting a virtual event, is it next week or the week after? I think it's next week now. And it's part 3. And that is a space for trans non-binary people to come and find solidarity and safety, and to talk things out, and for allies to listen and to learn. I think we've got 30, 40 people coming at the moment. It's free. It's a virtual space. It's an hour. And there's an invitation there if you'd like to join us.
Thank you for the invitation. I will be there. And by the time this episode is released, these things may have already occurred.
Sure.
But what I will do is I will link to places which are signposting to things happening in the future and all of the resources that you've mentioned. So with that being said, as much as this could go much further, I hope people listening can take this as a jump off point to further their learning, their understanding, and find different strategies for themselves. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Hannah. As I've said before, I'll place links in the description for them to connect with you and with diverse educators and all the resources we've discussed to explore your ideas, your work, and the work of diverse educators and your wonderful team. And to everyone, thank you for watching or listening, and I will see you in our next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Daryl.